Chapter 16 Executive Officer of the Heavy Cruiser CSS Hu Ming Li. Well, from our point of view, the last 2 years worked out great, Commander Childers. The work you did on the standard book is outstanding, and the characterization of the inner and outer system envelopes for all the Commonwealth planets will revolutionize our defensive doctrine, Vice Admiral Stepik said. Thank you, sir. I'm glad I could help. That being said, this is the Navy, so it will be some time before all the approvals are in hand to put the standard book out and enforce it on admirals and captains. Same thing with the changes to the spacing regulations, although that will probably go faster because it gives admirals and captains more options instead of fewer. So, it's time to return the favor and work on your career for a bit. You need to spend some time as an executive officer before you can command a heavy warship. As you know, the executive officer actually runs the ship administratively. That's a necessary skill set. You still have a year before you could be considered for captain, even on the fast track, so I've been looking for a 1-year berth for you. Get you back on ship. I would like that, sir. I figured you would say that, and I think I have just the thing for you. We had an engineering casualty on the CSS Jacques Cotillard out on Pahaden. She's making her way back under reduced power. We're going to send the new-build CSS Hu Ming Li out to replace her for the last year of her scheduled deployment, sort of the shakedown cruise for the Hu Ming Li. Natalie Rodriguez just made captain, and she's been named her skipper. How does executive officer on the Hu Ming Li sound, Commander? That sounds great, sir. Excellent. I like to mix people around, but I also hate to break up good teams. And I know Captain Rodriguez is going to adopt your book right off. I don't want to send you off with a captain who's going to insist on his own, and, to be honest, inferior book. Captain Rodriguez will be reporting to Rear Admiral Shi, and she's a good one, too. She got wind of the standard book through the grapevine and is reviewing it now. I wouldn't be surprised if she adopts it early for her squadron as a test case. The Hu Ming Li will bring her squadron back up to full complement, so squadron maneuvers per the standard book would be very useful in getting it approved. I think that's our business for today, Commander, unless you have any questions. No questions, sir, but I do have something for you. Jan pulled a chip out of her uniform jacket pocket and slid it across Stepik's desk. Is this what I think it is? It's the draft copy of my tactical book, sir. I may have some minor polishing to do, but I would appreciate your input on the book. I'd be happy to, Commander. I've been looking forward to it. So, after 2 years at Sigurdsson, Jan was assigned as executive officer of the CSS Hu Ming Li for a 1-year deployment to Pahaden. She and Bill said goodbye. They were both too young to think their relationship would be the last for either of them, and they both knew long deployments led to broken hearts. Commander Childers reporting aboard, ma'am, Jan said. Commander Childers! Sit down, sit down! How are you? I haven't seen you in 2 years, said Captain Natalie Rodriguez, captain of the Hu Ming Li. They've been keeping me busy at Sigurdsson, ma'am. So I've seen. You took our book from Niels Isaacson and expanded it a lot. Well, I had a lot of help, ma'am. The amount of staff they were willing to put on the project was sometimes overwhelming. That's good, though. With that kind of administrative experience, being XO on the Hu Ming Li won't be so overwhelming. I have to tell you, I was tickled pink when Admiral Stepik told me you would be my executive officer. I couldn't believe my luck. Me either, ma'am. I think Admiral Stepik is looking out for me. You? What about me? How I could pull the best tactician in the CSF. This is no time for modesty, Commander, as my XO on my first independent command of a heavy warship defies imagination. You know, I'm going to be using your new book on Hu Ming Li. As captain, it's my decision, and I'm adopting it whole hog. That's very gratifying, ma'am. Admiral Stepik told me you would probably use it. No question, never a doubt. And guess who our senior TAC officer is? Bev Bhatia. She's made lieutenant commander, and she helped you write the book on the Niels Isaacson in the first place. We have our book and a TAC department head who knows it already, and we haven't left Sigurdsson yet. You know Admiral Stepik really wants a good deployment test of the new book, putting us all together. I saw Lieutenant Commander Bhatia on the crew roster, ma'am. That's really great news. One thing it means is I can concentrate on getting the administrative side up and running without having to worry about tactical. There's a lot of other good people coming aboard, too. Some old friends, lots of good new people. I've been very pleased looking through the personnel files, and what I've heard about Admiral Xi is positive, too. She's reviewing your new book right now. We may be using it squadron-wide. Jan just shook her head. It was a dream. It had to be. Well, I was going to ask you to join me for dinner in the officers' mess, but if I know you, you'll be dining in the goat locker tonight. I thought it might make a difference on the XO, ma'am, but apparently not. Senior non-com aboard is Senior Chief Ivan Roberts. We've been friends a long time, since Aquitaine. He hit me with an invitation on my way down from the shuttle bay. There's a few chiefs and senior chiefs aboard from Niels Isaacson and Jeanne d'Arc as well. Well, it's not like we won't be seeing a lot of each other, Commander. Have a good time. We'll get down to business tomorrow. Commander Jan Childers, 5 feet tall, 23 years old, Executive Officer of the CSS Hu-Ming Li, CSF Combat Medal, CSF Science Medal with Cluster, Distinguished Service Medal with Cluster, Victorious Action Ribbon with 2 silver stars, was dressed in a plain midnight blue ship suit when she knocked on the door of the chief's mess aboard the Hu-Ming Li at 1800 hours. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ivan Roberts opened the door. Hi, Jan. Hi, Ivan. Long time no see. How you been? After 5 weeks in hyperspace, CSS Hu-Ming Li arrived in Pahadan. Jan found an electronic message waiting for her, delivered by fast courier while Hu-Ming Li was in transit. From Vice Admiral Janice Stepek, Tactical Division Personnel. To Commander Jan Childers, Executive Officer, CSS Hu-Ming Li. Subject, Book. Excellent. I wouldn't change a word. Permission to publish? FYI, I have classified it top secret. Commanding officers only. Well, that's interesting, Jan thought. After so much time working on the book, to have Admiral Stepek declare it finished in his opinion caught her by surprise. And whose opinion would be better? Jan sent a response in the affirmative. As a classified text, it would be published and distributed in-house within CSF by the publications section of the Tactical Division. Their royalties were competitive, though that made little difference to Jan. She never spent any money anyway, and it had just been piling up in her accounts. What would she spend it on? All her lodging, food, and clothes were free. Captain Rodriguez took Jan with her when she reported into Rear Admiral Jeanette Shee aboard Shee's flagship CSS Mateus Oliveira. Captain Rodriguez reporting as ordered, ma'am. Boy, am I glad to see you, Captain. We've been short-handed since we lost to Jacques Cotillard. It's nice to be back at full strength. Yes, ma'am. And my executive officer, Commander Childers. Pleased to meet you, Commander. You might be interested to know I have already informed Tactical Division we will be using your standard book for both squadron and ship maneuvers. You'll be able to watch firsthand. That's exciting, ma'am. I thought you'd like it. Come along, then. My staff has a briefing for you on what we'll be doing. Then we can talk. Some outer colony force had been probing Pahadan recently. They would stick their nose in, start to come in on the planet, and then flip ship and bug back out as they probed what the CSF response would be. The CSF forces varied their responses, so a future raid couldn't take advantage of their predictability. They had not used the ability to maneuver inside the published system periphery because none of the probes had been in a position to threaten the planet, and they had been unable to cut off the probing force's escape. The size of the probing force varied, from 1 ship to 4, from destroyers to heavy cruisers. By chance, none of them had ever transitioned out of hyperspace within beam weapon range of a CSF ship. After all, space was a big place, and 7 light seconds was not a lot of range in terms of the size of the patrol areas. Rear Admiral Shee's squadron had the northern approaches, the area on the system periphery above the ecliptic over the planet, while Rear Admiral Brendan Patel's heavy cruiser squadron had the area below the ecliptic. Vice Admiral Jane Pulaski and her battleships stayed in Pahadan orbit. What Admiral Shee wanted to do, and Admiral Pulaski had approved, is set a trap for these incursions. They would sucker in as many as they could. They would initially close off the northern approaches. If it worked out, the incursions should move to the southern approaches. Admiral Patel's group would then do the same thing on the southern approaches and hopefully get some more. We think we can fry more fish if we don't close the whole system at once. When ships sent to the north don't come back, and the ones from the south do, they should shift to the south rather than stop trying. Any questions or comments? She asked Rodriguez and Jan. Jan looked at Rodriguez, and she nodded. One comment, ma'am. I think it may be even more effective if we can convince the probing ships the ones that hyper out are battleships instead of heavy cruisers. Have 2 of Admiral Pulaski's battleships maintain some power discipline in orbit, and have 2 of our outer group wasting power, so that 2 in orbit look like heavy cruisers, and 2 on patrol look like battleships. We can rotate that duty to make it easier on crews around Pohadan and systems on the patrol ships. They won't be as afraid that battleships can catch them, Jan said. Oh, I like that. It's sneaky. Thank you, ma'am. Over the next month, the squadron practiced maneuvers, with each of the heavy cruisers taking turns as the probing force. All the maneuvers of the squadron were from the standard book, but the ship playing the probing force could do whatever it wanted, as long as she respected the published system periphery. Each ship's captain had a couple of opportunities to try to outwit or outmaneuver the squadron. They had reached a level of proficiency in maneuvers such that none ever succeeded when the time came to use them against a real enemy. All right, what have we got this time? Captain Vincent Gadet asked on the bridge of the LNS Defender. Looks like there's half a dozen heavy cruisers spread out inside the system periphery, and then these 2 battleships outside the system periphery over here, sir, Lieutenant Commander Paul Oransky said. Are we sure those are battleships? I show 4 battleships and 2 heavy cruisers in orbit around the planet, sir, so if they've replaced the heavy cruiser that went missing for a while, that would be the same ship's complement as before. Okay, so they think the battleships will be able to hyper into our exit position and get us on the way out. That's what it looks like, sir. Let's head on in and see what they do. Squadron orders, ahead full. The 4 Lotteden light cruisers began accelerating to Pohadan at 1.7 gravities. Jan was standing watch on the bridge of the Hu-Ming Li when the hyper transition was detected. Sound general quarters. Sounding general quarters, ma'am. What have we got, Tactical? 4 light cruisers at 010 Mark 030 on the sun, ma'am. They're powering up. Outer colony design. They're heading toward Pohadan at 1.7 gravities, Ensign Robert Dunleavy said. The Hu-Ming Li was one of the 2 ships in Admiral Xi's squadron pretending to be a battleship this cycle. It was up to her and the Aluna Kamau to close the door. Navigation plan Red 5 at 6 light seconds. Executing Red 5, ma'am. Jan got out of the command chair as Captain Rodriguez came on the bridge. Lieutenant Commander Bhatia also arrived and took up the secondary tactical console. They were all seated before general quarters timed out, and they went to 0G as the normal space drive was cut to 0 thrust for transition to hyperspace. The best modulation technique for each situation had been programmed into the navigation computer per the standard book and no longer required manual entry. We have 4 light cruisers at 010 Mark 030 making a run on the planet, ma'am. We're executing Red 5, 5 light seconds. Excellent, Commander. Let's see if we can't catch them. Tactical, what are our squadron mates doing? All are heading toward the bogies at their best speed, ma'am. At that point, they transitioned into hyper and could no longer see the action. Stand down to skies. Standing down to skies, ma'am. Those 2 battleships just hypered out, sir. The heavy cruisers are headed toward us at 1.4 gravities, Oransky said. Okay, I think we've seen enough. Flip ship and then bring us to 165 Mark 15 on our inbound vector. Let's not show up where those battleships are going to be. We'll aim for that gap in the heavy cruisers, Goddard said. Flip ship and come to 165 Mark 15, sir. Executing. They're flipping ship, sir, Lieutenant Commander Petra Adams said from Tactical. Let's see what vector they take. Start preparing for hyper, said Captain Sven McAllen, captain of the CSS Ikaiki Kalani. Their flip is complete. They're making their turn. Looks like 165 Mark 015 on their original vector, sir. Steady on 165 Mark 015 at 1.7 gravities. Plot their course. Plotted, sir. Transition to hyper. As soon as we transition, send the plot. Red 4 was a general maneuver to place the ship outside the designated mark, usually a bogey, and drop back into normal space. Red 5 was the same command, but to hold in hyperspace. CSS Hu-Ming Li and CSS Aluna Kamau were standing by in hyperspace when CSS Ika Kalani transitioned to hyperspace and transmitted the bogey's course, which traveled the distance between the ships in hyperspace in seconds. Navigation plan Red 2 at 6 light seconds, Rodriguez said. Red 2 at 6 light seconds, ma'am. Coordinate down transition with the Ika Kalani. Firing plan Beta, guns free. Coordinating with the Ika Kalani, ma'am. Firing plan Beta, ma'am. Sir, one of those heavy cruisers just made a hyperspace transition, Oransky said. How the hell can they do that this deep inside the system periphery? Goddard asked. Well, they know their own system better than we do, sir. The horrifying possibilities hit Goddard like a hammer. Evasive maneuvers! The Hu-Ming Li and Ika Ika Kalani dropped out of hyperspace directly behind the 4 Lottodon light cruisers and with overtake velocity. They had turned ship, but there had not been enough time to build the side vector needed to take them out of the reach of the heavy cruiser's guns. Per firing plan Beta, the CSF ships spread their fire over the targets. The heavy cruisers fired 3 times each. All 4 targets were destroyed. That went extremely well. Congratulations, all of you, Rear Admiral Xi said. It was a video conference among the ships of the squadron, held in hyperspace to minimize time lag. The destroyers CSS Howard and CSS Pomona, detached from Admiral Pulaski squadrons at Pohadan, stood picket in normal space in the outer envelope to watch for any incursions. Either could transition to hyperspace to alert them while the other continued plotting. The video conference included all 8 ships' captains, all 8 executive officers, Admiral Xi, and her chief of staff. Admiral Pulaski passes on her compliments. Given our success, she has abandoned the original plan to delay closing the southern approaches and has ordered Admiral Patel to take the same defensive posture now. His ships have been practicing too in order to be ready, so we are now in a position to shut down Pohadan against these incursions. Even better, examination of the wreckage of the intruding force indicates they were the LNS Defender, LNS Enforcer, LNS Protector, and the LNS Vindicator of the Lottodon Navy. That allows the foreign minister to take this up with the Lottodon ambassador. And one final note. The operation was so successful and so convincing, Admiral Pulaski has decided 6 ships are sufficient to maintain patrol at any given time. She has authorized 1 in 4 rotations for R&R on Pohadan. They had been spacing pretty hard trying to cover against the incursions, with supply ships restocking them in position and no opportunity for planet leave. This announcement therefore drew a round of applause. It's kind of hard to draw numbers out of a hat in Hyper, so we're going to have to do that for you here. But you'll all get your turn, and then we're on rotation. There was one more incursion of 2 heavy cruisers before Lotoda decided sending ships into Pohadan only to have them disappear without a trace was not a winning strategy. That was on the southern approaches, and Admiral Patel's squadron dispatched them with the same cold efficiency. About 5 months into the Hu-Ming Li's deployment in Pohadan, the secure electronic dispatches to command personnel included an electronic copy of a new book on tactics, The Science of Surprise, Creating Military Advantage, by Commander Jan Childers, Ph.D., CM, SM2, DSM2, VA4. Command personnel included executive officers, and when she received hers, Jan was surprised to see they included her 4th Victorious Action Ribbon for the combat against the Lottodon light cruisers here in Pohadan. She wouldn't receive it until end of tour in Sigurdsson, but it had apparently already been recorded. Over the next 2 months, Jan received dozens of congratulations or kind words from admirals, captains, and executive officers throughout the CSF, both from friends and from people she had never met. That included nice messages from Admirals Pulaski, Xi, and Patel. And while the book was secret, with distribution limited to command personnel only, word the CSF had published Jan's tactics book leaked below decks. They held a party for her in the goat locker. They had cake. Chapter 17. Alliance. After a year, Jan returned to Sigurdsson from the deployment to Pohadan aboard the Hu-Ming Li. She was once more ensconced in a furnished temporary apartment in an officer's housing block near the Tactical Division building. 2 hours after Jan arrived, there was a delivery of flowers with a simple card. Remember me? WC. She punched a familiar number on her phone. Campbell. Well, it's not likely I would forget you. One can't be sure. You know those up-and-coming Tactical Division types, Captain. Jan laughed and invited him over. It was like nothing had changed, like no time had passed at all. After the first thrill of seeing each other again had worn off a bit, Jan asked him about it. I would think a brilliant, handsome young officer would have the ladies eating out of his hand, and lieutenant commander to boot. What gives? Lose your touch? Jan asked. I did try. I just couldn't get interested. After the best, there's just the rest. You've spoiled me for life. For life? Well, for 12 months anyway. Jan laughed, then grew serious. You know I'm going to get assigned out again. Yeah, I know. I don't want to think about it. I have a month's planet leave, so let's not think about it. We have what we have. I have to say, Captain Childers, your book of maneuvers made a huge difference for the heavy cruiser squadrons in Bahadan. They had been powerless to respond to the repeated incursions by Latada, even to figuring out who it was doing them. With your book, Admiral Shi and Patel completely shut down the Latadans, and the diplomats have been able to handle it from there, Vice Admiral Stepik said. Thank you, sir. Jan had received her promotion to captain, as well as another victorious action ribbon on the return to Jablanka of the Hu Ming Li. She was 24 years old. Also, Science of Surprise has been getting rave reviews from readers across the CSF, including people I would normally consider to be at odds with each other on various issues. It's been gratifying to me to publish something that got good reviews almost across the board rather than great from one side and terrible from the other. I imagine you've been getting some direct feedback as well. Yes, sir. It's been a little unbelievable. Well, in my opinion, it's the best addition to the field of tactics in at least 50 years. We're going to redesign ATS and set it up to teach the book. The exercises will be redesigned to allow innovative solutions and will be scored by the results obtained. That's really good to hear, sir. I'm going to want you to stop back through Sigurdsson once they have the course together and go through the materials for me. Make sure we got it right, and square up any place where it isn't. It won't be long, maybe 6 months or so. That will also help us sell the new course to hire if you're directly involved. You've got some new fans where it counts, Captain. I'll be happy to help, sir. But that will be a little while yet, so let's come back around to your career. I think one thing you could use is a broader view. You've got a lot of experience by now with individual ship and squadron operations, but those are just the means to an end, which is protecting Commonwealth systems. Somebody's starting to stir up trouble in Calumet, and I think they could use a little boost to their tactical depth out there until they get it buttoned down. I was thinking Senior Tactical Officer in the Planetary Combat Information Center for a year or so. Senior TAC in a planetary CIC is a captain's berth, usually after a stint shipboard. But you're just coming off a shipboard assignment, so it works for me. And it will give you a system-wide view at the center of the sensor net. How does that sound to you, Captain? That sounds interesting, sir. It'd certainly be a different view of things. About 2 days after Jan received her orders to deploy as Senior Tactical Officer for the Calumet Planetary Combat Information Center, using fastest available transport, Bill had some news. Jan, I made discreet inquiries. One of the things we intelligence division types are supposed to do in a career path to senior rank is to have assignments on other planets of the Commonwealth. Not become a Sigurdsson rat who knows nothing beyond headquarters. So I asked around, and there's a lieutenant commander's berth open at the Calumet Planetary Intelligence Center. If I want to do a 1-year stint on Calumet, I can. Jan's heart leapt, but she clamped down on it hard. Is that really what's best for you? For your career? Well, I have to do some planetary assignments. Truth be told, I've been holding back a bit because I didn't want to miss your swing through here between assignments. And they've been pushing me. I seem to be one of those up-and-coming types too, though it's harder to get promotions out of the zone in intelligence than it is for you combat types. So yes, it's good for me, if it's what you want. We never really talked about the future we both knew we didn't have, but this assignment's a whole year. Given that both positions are on Calumet Fleet Base, if we put in for it as a couple, we can even have a larger apartment together rather than two separate. If that's what you want. Jan released the clamps on her heart. Yes, it's what I want, she said, throwing her arms around him. What a dumb question. I thought they called you guys intelligence. Jan's orders specified fastest available transport, which turned out to be a passenger liner making the Jablanka-Calumet Kodu run. It also meant not on standby. Bill's orders didn't include that phrasing, so he would normally space on standby or take military transport, but they had put in for couples housing on Calumet. So they traveled together, and their joint transport to Calumet went on the higher priority orders. The accommodations were also set by the higher ranked of the two. While a lieutenant commander would space economy class, a captain or above would space business class. It wasn't first class, but it was a huge step up from economy class. The result was that they had a business class cabin for two on a passenger liner, the CPS Star Surfer. The passenger liner was built on the same scale as a CSF battleship, but with 8 even larger cylinders and no guns. 2 of the cylinders, the 2 that would be topside on a CSF warship, were crew quarters and ship functions, while the other 6 cylinders, below decks on a CSF warship, were passenger accommodations. 1 cylinder was first class, 2 business class, and 3 economy class. It had the same belts of containers around the bows that a warship would have, for reaction mass tanks and stores, the same 4 large radiators aft of the cylinders to radiate away excess heat, and the same shuttle accommodations on the bows. There were 2 dining rooms aboard, the economy dining room and the first class dining room. Business class passengers ate in the first class dining room. Further, unlike a freighter, the liner would maintain a 1G cruising acceleration throughout the voyage for the comfort of the passengers. Their cabin had a bedroom with a double bed, a small bathroom, and a small outer room with 2 comfy padded swivel chairs at a small desk. The cabinet above the desk held 2 head and hands VR kits, but the swivel chairs included immersive VR interfaces for people with implants. The swivel chairs also included swivel locks and seatbelts for the inevitable zero-G maneuvers. The bathroom contained a toilet and sink, and had a handheld shower head on the wall. There was no shower curtain. The whole 4-foot by 2-foot bathroom was the shower stall. And water was unmetered, fresh water being drawn from the reaction mass tanks in the bows, and gray water returned to them in sequence. The ship used the gray water tanks first when underway. "This is tiny. You sure this is business class?" Bill asked. "Are you kidding? 2 rooms? This is a palace for shipboard accommodations. This is the size of a senior captain's cabin on a battleship," Jan said. "Well, I don't space much. Actually, never." "Never?" "I was born and raised on Jablanca, and never left the planet." "How did you get through the academy?" "An intelligence track from early on. We don't do the shipboard parts of the curriculum. We have a different sequence." Jan stared at him. She had spent probably half of the last 7 years living on board ship. Being in cramped quarters aboard seemed like coming home to her. She looked around the cabin, saw the universal symbol on a cabinet above the desk. She opened it, looked over the contents, then extracted a small bottle. "Here, put this in a pocket and carry it with you everywhere," Jan said, handing Bill the bottle. "What are these?" "Weightlessness pills. If you don't know that you can tolerate weightlessness, take one anytime the zero-G warning sounds. Being weightless sick is no fun." "Well, what about you?" "I found out weightlessness doesn't bother me after I got to Sigurdsson. They tested me for it on first deployment, but 1/3 of people can never get used to it. When I was on my initial trip from Earth to Jablanca, I took them religiously just in case, rather than find out the hard way." There was a soft chime from the door. Jan pushed the open button, and the door slid away into the wall. An assistant purser was at the door, and he handed Jan a small gift-wrapped package. "Captain's compliments, ma'am." "Why, thank you." She looked up at the purser. "Just to satisfy my curiosity, is this something every passenger gets?" "Oh, no, ma'am. A lot of us aboard are former CSF, ma'am. Captain is too. We stay in touch with our friends." "We're happy to have you aboard, ma'am." "Give the captain my regards, please, purser." "Yes, Admiral. Thank you, ma'am." The assistant purser saluted and left. Jan pushed the button to close the door. "It seems your reputation precedes you," Bill said. "So it seems." "But, Admiral? Oh, you ground pounders. There can only be one captain aboard ship, and one dare not address someone below their rank, so the custom is to call any visiting captain Admiral." "Ah." Jan opened the package. It was a gold ship's medallion for the CPS Star Surfer, as would be given to senior officers of the ship at the end of a stint. "Oh my. How special." Jan opened the card. "We've been requested to dine at the captain's table in the first-class dining room throughout the voyage." "Really?" "Yep. It would be my honor to welcome you to dine with me at the captain's table for the duration of the passage to Calumet." "Wow." "Yeah. You know what that means, though. Full uniform at meals 3 times a day. No ship suits, no civvies." "Well, we signed up to wear the uniform. We'll manage." They wore their uniforms to meals. Jan's was much gaudier than Bill's, displaying the Combat Medal, the Science Medal with cluster, the Distinguished Service Medal with cluster, and the Victorious Action Ribbon with 3 silver stars. Bill's uniform, though, had Intelligence Division unit badges, and they didn't give anybody medals for anything. Medal? For what? Nothing happened. Hush hush, and all that. On the way to and from meals, they found themselves saluted by crew members. Force of habit, Jan guessed, from former CSF spacers. As civilian employees of the Commonwealth Star Line, they had no obligation of courtesy to salute, but salute they did, and rather than argue with each and every one of them, Jan returned the salutes as she would to a fellow spacer. At meals, Jan, as the senior officer of the two of them, introduced Bill as her companion with no further details per Commonwealth custom. It was nobody else's business, really. The captain of the Star Surfer had retired from the CSF with the rank of captain and took a captain's slot with the Commonwealth Star Line. He had space in his blood and would probably serve until they kicked him out. His companion was a long-time service wife, who was happy that now, with him in civilian employment, she could accompany her husband on his duty tours. CSL captains spaced 6 months on and 6 months off, so they spent the other half of the year at their home on Kodu. Jan and Bill spent the 3-week trip studying up on Calumet. They couldn't review classified materials, as the Star Surfer did not have any CSF-certified secure spaces, but they could review other materials up to and including confidential. It was a pleasant and uneventful crossing, and they arrived at Calumet on schedule to begin their duties. Chapter 18. Senior Tactical Officer, Calumet Planetary Combat Information Center. Talk to me, Tactical. Vice Admiral Alice Chang walked across the flag bridge to her command chair and sat down, scanning the displays. Fleet Tactical Officer Captain Gerald Shaw turned toward her with his report. Approximately 400 point sources at 100 locations or so, ma'am, distributed around this half of the system periphery. They are filling in as sensor reports come in. It looks like a globular decoy pattern. No indications yet of which of the bogies are not decoys, if any. They're accelerating in-system at 1G. Chang pushed a stud on her chair arm. See, I see. Have you got anything yet on which of these bogies might actually be hostiles? Not yet, ma'am, but we are getting what looks like some bleed-through on bogies 9, 13, and 18. All right. Keep a special eye on them. Let me know if anything changes. Yes, ma'am. The decoys themselves were a robotically controlled, cheap, small power plant and drive system mounted on some small mass like an asteroid. They burned off extra waste heat as well, for their limited lifetimes. The problem was, while you couldn't make a decoy look like a warship, you could make a warship look like a decoy. The decoy generated enough radiation you could emulate a decoy with a warship if you were careful. Bleed-through was the same thing as less than careful. A failure to simulate the decoy well enough permitted the leakage of a warship's spectral signature through the noise of a fake decoy signal, and bogies 9, 13, and 18, among the earliest reported, were a triangle at the closest point of the system periphery to the planet, below the ecliptic. Pretty much the closest bogies, which is why their sensor signals got there in the first batch. What does Planetary CIC say? Have they issued any advisories yet? We just got a situation report from them, ma'am. They note the apparent bleed-through of bogies 9, 13, and 18, but they believe those are faked and attempt to draw us out of position. They believe bogies 36, 43, 44, 49, and 58, or some subset of them, are more likely to be actual hostiles. Although they admit no bleed-through has been seen yet. Those are all above the ecliptic, ma'am. So the desk jockeys weigh in. Anybody want to cover my bet they're wrong? To the answering silence, Chang said, I didn't think so. Chang drummed her fingers on the arm of her command chair. She continued to watch the displays as additional sensor data came in. Additional bogies continued filling out the sphere. That was to be expected, but the Planetary CIC report was an itch she couldn't scratch. Who's got Planetary CIC right now? Who issued that report? It's a Captain Childers, ma'am. She assumed command when the first sensor report started coming in. Captain Jan Childers? Yes, ma'am. Forget everything I just said. I withdraw my wager offer. My compliments to Captain Childers, and would you request her tactical recommendation? Yes, ma'am. Jan Childers wasn't quite a legend in the CSF. Not yet, anyway. But if there was any justice, she soon would be. Chang had read her book, The Science of Surprise, Creating Military Advantage, and was a huge fan. So was the Navy brass, who had immediately classified the book and restricted access to command ranks. Tactical Division was considering a new tactical course beyond ATS just to teach the book, or maybe a course teaching the book to replace ATS altogether. Of course, you always tried to surprise the enemy, but Childers had written what might be the definitive treatment, pulling in human psychology, weapons, propulsion, and sensor technologies, the new maneuver capabilities she herself had developed, and the doctrine and practices of over a dozen navies, including Earth's, the Commonwealth's, and the biggest and most dangerous polities in the outer colonies. It was a stunning achievement. And it wasn't just everybody who had received both the CSF Combat Medal and the CSF Science Medal. As a matter of fact, Chang didn't think anyone else ever had, not to mention 2 DSMs and 4 Victorious Action Ribbons. Oh, and come, tell her I read her book. Ma'am? Just tell her. Yes, ma'am. They're going for it, sir. Finally decided what they were going to do, eh? The passive sensor scans now showed several Commonwealth warships accelerating out toward each of the 3 bleed-through decoys. By the energy signatures and the acceleration levels, the inferred masses were right for all the heavy ships, battleships, and heavy cruisers the Commonwealth routinely deployed here in Calumet. Their complement of lighter combatants looked a little thin as compared to normal Commonwealth practice, but there had been a redeployment of lighter elements in patrol groups, trying to interdict just this sort of drive-by shooting they were here to perform. The passive scans also showed a couple of dozen large freighters lumbering for the system periphery, trying to get out before the shooting started. They had started to flee the moment their commercial sensors picked up the decoys, and had kept heading out in dribs and drabs ever since. In a commerce raid like this, they were targets, and their captains knew it. They ran for the limit in the other direction from the Commonwealth warships, above the ecliptic, the safest vector to stay out of the range of fire. By luck, several of those freighters were fleeing directly toward the 3 actual squadrons of Samaran ships. They would destroy them on their way past, overfly the planet, destroying space infrastructure as they went, and accelerate out the other side of the system before the Commonwealth ships could get themselves slowed down and come back at them. Captain Michael Oberlin of the light cruiser SSN Falcon turned to his navigator, Lieutenant Commander Terry Cosworth. Maintain emissions lockdown and decoy signature. Let's see how long we can delay them figuring out what's really going on. Admiral Chang watched the screens as they neared weapons range of the 4 inbound point sources of Bogey 44. They would find out soon whether she had decided correctly. If they were actual hostiles, they would be light units, no match for the big Commonwealth battleship and cruiser, and with nowhere near their weapons range. Still, she wasn't going to get too close. When they came within her weapons range, she made the call. All right, they're committed, and so are we. Time to take the masks off and see who's who. Fleet orders. Bring us up to full military power and bring up the shields. Active scanners. Commence firing plan Alpha. Yes, ma'am. Captain Oberlin studied the passive sensors. Okay, they're committed. There's no way they can come back at us now. Bring us up to full military power and power up the shields. Active scanners. Those freighters will be in range in 5 minutes. Start working up firing solutions. Yes, sir. Status change. Sir, those freighters... Oberlin's attention snapped back to the display. What had been a couple of lumbering freighters headed his way now blazed with heavy warship power levels. Their acceleration had doubled, and his ships were being painted with active sensors. Hard to starboard! Maximum acceleration! Oberlin screamed. But it was much too late. Admiral Chang watched the displays as her flagship, the battleship CSS Kriegsmädchen, and her consort, the heavy cruiser CSS Minako Kusunoki, fired on the decoys. Just as her ships began to fire, the 4 point sources of Bogey 44 revealed themselves to be 2 Samaran light cruisers and 2 Samaran destroyers as they brought their military systems up. 7 seconds later, her beams arrived. 5 seconds after that, her second salvo arrived. 5 seconds after that, her third salvo wasted itself on debris. Come, let Admiral Bzowski know they can stand down their power levels and order them to return to Calumet orbit. Then, see if you can't raise Captain Childers for me. Yes, ma'am. Sir, Admiral Chang advises we can stand down our power levels and orders us to return to Calumet orbit. The actual hostiles have been destroyed. Excellent. Pass those orders on, Lieutenant Romano. I know our captains have been fretting about maintaining those power levels. Doesn't seem right to be running power plants at maximum military power just to radiate the heat away while we're accelerating at a slowpoke heavy ship levels. Well, it apparently fooled them, sir. For as long as needed, anyway. Get those orders out, Lieutenant. Yes, sir. The destroyers and light cruisers that had been straining to maintain routine heavy cruiser and battleship power levels finally gave their power plants and radiators a break, and began to decelerate at their higher normal rates as the first step to returning to Calumet. My compliments, Captain Childers. Your tactical plan worked to perfection. Thank you. Your command carried it out perfectly, ma'am. That was nicely done as well. Thank you, Captain. I have a question, though. Why were you so sure the actual hostiles were among bogies 36, 43, 44, 49, and 58? The actual decoys were robots, ma'am. They all began accelerating inward exactly 15 minutes after their transition from hyperspace. Bogies 36, 44, and 49 started accelerating a tiny bit later. The difference wasn't large, a few tenths of a millisecond, but that indicated those bogies were different. Probably a minor difference in the software and computer systems of the actual ships from that of the decoys, or delays in slightly different control runs. We didn't have a good read on bogies 43 and 58, so we weren't sure whether they were decoys or ships. I included them for safety, but as you saw, they were decoys as well. So, 3 acted slightly differently, and we knew it wasn't over 100 hostile squadrons and 3 decoys, so those 3 must be the hostile squadrons. Yes, ma'am. Excellent work, Captain. And the use of our destroyers and light cruisers to simulate our heavies was a nice touch. We had to show them heavy cruisers and battleships, ma'am, because they were expecting to see them. They let you get closer than any commander of a squadron of light combatants should have otherwise, freighter power levels or not. And they were far enough away from Admiral Bzovsky's ships, their sensors couldn't see through the disguise at that distance. You were much closer, but it's easier to simulate the lower power levels of a freighter than it is to simulate the higher power levels of a larger ship. I see that. Well, it was good work, Captain, and your role will figure prominently in my report. I appreciate that, ma'am. If I might offer one further suggestion? Go ahead, Captain. I would advise not issuing any public statement about this attempted attack at all. To any questions from the press about reported fleet movements, we should just say we occasionally conduct exercises against simulated opponents and leave it at that. So Samara sends 12 ships and almost 1,000 decoys to conduct a hit-and-run raid, and they just disappear with no indication of what happened to them? Yes, ma'am. You have a mean streak, Captain Childers. Yes, ma'am. And, after a slight pause, thank you, ma'am.